Hello, welcome to the channel. I'm Lauro Miller and I make videos about programming. Today we'll talk about objects in JavaScript, and to be honest, they are everywhere. Whenever you're working with JavaScript, you will be working with objects. So it definitely makes sense to get a thorough understanding of how they work. Let's switch to Notion and let's get started. Here is what we will talk about. We'll start with creating objects. We then move on to talking about getters and setters. We talk about spreading, and we finish with methods and the this keyword. Let's create a new file here, and this is going to be called creating.js. Now, you should already be quite familiar with creating objects if you followed the previous discussions of this series, but just to make things, just to summarize everything, let's create a new location, and that's going to be an object. It's going to have the city. The city is going to be Berlin. It's going to have some zip code, right? Zip code here, I don't know, 1,000. We can say it 1,000. And we're going to have a country. And the country is going to be Germany. And here we have three properties. We have the city property and it has a value of Berlin. We have the zip code property and it has a numerical value of 1,000. And we have the country property with also a string of Germany. Of course, we could have more complex types here. We could have an object, we could have an array. Everything is fine. Now we can also declare methods, and methods here we could say get formatted address, for example. And this is going to be a method if we use these parentheses here. And this, for example, return, if we want to format the address, let's write a few of the elements here, this dot city dash, and then we're going to have this dot zip code, comma, this dot country. Right, so if I were here to write console.log, location.getFormatted_address, then I should see a nicely printed screen. Let's save this, and here back at the console, let's try to run with node creating.js. And as you can see, the address prints just fine. Now there is one particular issue here that I want to mention to you, and it is that we can use a few shortcuts when creating objects. So imagine that we have, for example, already the city information stored in a variable, and we don't really want to repeat or do something like city colon and then here city, right? So suppose we also have zip code. Let's put everything in other variables here. We have a zip code with 1,000 and we have a country with Germany, like so. Then, well, you could do, while doing something like this is totally fine, zip code, and country, we can actually take a few shortcuts. If the name of a variable is exactly the name of the property we want to create, we can simply omit this second part here, and we just have city, zip code, and country. So this is one example of how we can have a more compact syntax when creating objects. Now let's go back a little bit, and this is very similar to another pattern that we often use with objects, and it is the pattern of destructuring a certain variable based on an object. So you saw that we had kind of these shortcuts here. Of course, here we'll have a couple of errors because I don't have any variables before, but if we have a certain object that has certain properties, we can access them, we can create and assign values to a certain variable simultaneously by using the following construct. So if I use const city is equal to location, this is going to create a new variable called city, and it's going to automatically assign the value Berlin to it. Now, if I were to console.log city, for example, like so, and here let's try to run this again, I'm gonna get Berlin. Now this does not affect the object itself. Even if I use this, even if I use this pattern here, the city will still be in the object. It's not gonna be removed, it's not gonna be deleted from the object. If I save this and I run, then I will still have the whole address. Now what may happen is that once I destructure, or that, well, that's called destructuring. I think we'll talk a little bit more about this in a specific video for this part. But once I access the city, I can actually access other properties of the object. And remember, we talked about this when we talked about how to handle parameters in functions. And here I can say that, for example, rest. And if I were to say rest.getFormattedAddress, then I'm going to get something different because the city is not part of this REST object. Remember, the REST object is going to be everything that was not included or that was not explicitly mentioned before. Let's console.log rest here just for the sake of examining how the object looks like. And you see that we have an object with two properties, zip code and country, and one method, getFormattedAddress. That's it for creating objects. Let's start talking about getters and setters. So I'm going to create a new file here, new file, getter setter.js. And here I'm going to copy again the whole location because we will use the same example. So imagine that I want to access this get formatted address, but as through a property style, quote unquote. I can have such a construct in JavaScript. So get formatted address, for example, this is going to be pretty much the same. It's going to behave pretty much the same. And here, let me just return to a previous state where it makes more sense. So this way, formatted address here, let's now console.log location.formattedaddress. Like so, this is going to output exactly the same thing as this previous pattern with a method. If I save this here and I come to the console, I'm going to clear everything and I'll say node getter setter.js and I get exactly the same result. Now, this is what we call a getter in JavaScript, and you can define such a construct if you want to have such a syntax in your code. Now, this is one way of doing it, and using the method is the other way of doing it. To be honest, I think that the method is more clear whenever we have an action happening on the object, right? So if I want to get some information from the object, I think that this translates quite well, maps quite well to the concept of acting on the object. So I prefer to use methods in these cases. Here we can also have setters. So if I say set formatted address, for example, formatted address, and then here I'm going to receive a new address. And here this is going to do something. So I could console.log, let's say I received, and then here we'll say new address. And we will simply say location.formattedaddress is equal to, I don't know, Frankfurt dash 90 and Germany again, right? So I know the numbers don't make sense, but once I save this and I run the program, then you see I received Frankfurt dash 90 Germany. Now, of course, you can act upon this information. You can do stuff with the new address. So you could check if type of new address is a string. So if the new address is a string, then, or new address, I don't know, however you want to pronounce it, then we'll say this dot city is going to be equal to new address dot split. We're going to split this at dash, and we're going to take the first element. I'm going to trim it. Now, of course, I'm making a few assumptions here. I'm making the assumption that the formatted address is going to follow a certain pattern. It's going to have some strings, then it's going to have a dash, then it's going to have something else. Now, if it doesn't have a dash, then of course this whole thing here may blow up, but it's also your responsibility to add additional checks to make sure that the input matches your desired formatting. So now if I remove this and we'll say location.formattedaddress, and then here we console.log location.city, for example, then I should see Frankfurt instead of Berlin. Let's save this and let's run. And that's exactly what we get. So we get Frankfurt. As you can see, we can then do different things with this information. We could do some validations. We could update multiple fields simultaneously. And this is one way of using setter to actually update information in the object. Of course, you can also use a simple method. So set formatted address, for example, and here we'll say set formatted address to Frankfurt 90 Germany. This is going to have exactly the same effect. I'll save this and run the code again, and you see that I get Frankfurt as the output. So yeah, quick discussion about getters and setters. To be honest, I'm more of the opinion, so I like to work more with methods, but it's important for you to know that these getters and setters, they exist because some libraries, for example, they use getters and setters. For example, if you came across MobX for state management in React applications, it's one library that works with classes, and there they prefer that you use getters and setters. So the behavior is pretty much the same as you just saw in the code, but the library has some checks and enforces you to use these kind of fields. I think it's beneficial that you're familiar with them, and that's why I'm presenting them to you. So now let's move on and talk about spreading. I'm going to create a new file here at the IDE. I'm going to call this spreading.js. And spreading is a construct, is a technique that we can use to copy values from one object to another object. I'm going to say copy values from one object to another object. Now there are, of course, immediately two use cases for this. And the first one is to have an object with default values that we can use to populate another object, right? So imagine that we have some user input and we don't know if all the fields are going to be defined, and we want to ensure that we have a few default values. We can use a base object and then use spreading to copy this object into the new object and merge it with the incoming information from the user. And the second one is to copy objects. And here I'm going to write shallow for the moment because that is exactly the type of copy that we get. And that's one thing we need to be aware of. That's one thing we need to be careful with. So let's discuss spreading in details. Here is how it looks like. Let's take an example of a default location values. And here I'm going to copy again from getter and setter the city, the zip code, and the country. All right, so city, zip code, and country are here. And if I want to say, for example, incoming, let's say incoming location values, this is information from the user. Let's say we asked for the street, and here that is going to be, I don't know, street, some street, and the number is going to be 10. And now we want to have a final location, and the final location is going to be the default location values and the incoming location values. Now, as you can see here, I have used twice these 3 dots, and in the context of creating objects, the 3 dots, they actually refer to the spreading operation. Now, you may have seen, I mean, if you watched the previous discussions of the series, you already saw many times the 3 dots in other contexts. And what happens is that these 3 dots here, they have different behaviors depending on the context. So it's important that you are aware that they can have a different behavior once we use them with objects and once we use them with arrays. And if we use them while creating objects or while accessing values of an object, they are going to have different behaviors. So it's important for you to be aware of all of them and to be careful when using it and making sure that you really understand what the 3 dots are doing and if this is really what you want them to do. Let's console.log the final location, and we are going to explore a few different combinations, a few different cases that can happen. So what the 3 dots are doing is they are copying all the properties from the default location values and adding these properties to the object final location. We then move to the next 3 dots, which copy all the properties and methods. Of course, the methods are also copied, but here let's stick to properties. We are copying all the properties from the incoming location values, and we are also adding them to the final location. So here we should have a final location with 5 properties: city, zip code, country, street, and number. And let's console.log this on the screen. So I'm going to clean this and node spreading.js, and we have the object with 5 keys. Of course, what happens if here I also have a city, right? So what if I have another city here, Frankfurt, and as you can see, we have conflict keys, so we have conflict properties. which one is going to be chosen? That depends on the order that we pass the initial objects or the previous objects to the new object. So the last one basically wins. That's the rule. The last one that appears wins. If we pass it in this order with default location first and incoming location after, then the city from incoming location is going to be the chosen one. If we switch the order, then the city from the default location is going to be the chosen one. If I save this and I run, you see that we have a Frankfurt here in city. Let's switch the order and let's see what happens. So I switch the order here, I save, and once I run it again, now we have Berlin in the city. So basically the last one wins. And that's why I say that one of the use cases for the spreading operator is to have an object with default values that we can use to populate. And then if the incoming values, they have the same property, then this incoming value will just override the value that is coming from the default object. That's quite useful, and it helps you ensure that, let's say, for example, here we have an array of zip codes, right? An array of zip codes for a certain location. And then here in the incoming location, we actually have no zip codes. So we will ensure that the final location at least has an empty array for zip codes. And this allows us to work with zip codes under the assumptions that, or under the assumption that they will always be, I mean, we need to be careful in the code that we don't change zip code somewhere else. But for this simple example, it enables us to work with zip codes under the assumption that they will always be an array and that they will have methods that come with arrays. So here, if I wanted to print the final location dot zip codes dot length, for example, that would be possible because I'm ensuring that I'm populating zip codes. Of course, if here in my incoming location value, I get a different type of zip codes, a different value type for zip codes, which does not have the length property, I'm going to have a problem, right? I'm going to have undefined because numbers do not have this length property. If even worse here, if I pass null as the zip codes and I save this, then my program will actually throw an error because null and undefined, they have no properties. So having the default values do not really remove the responsibility for doing this sanitization checks and making sure that the input and that the fields are what we expect them to be, but they can help us with it. Let's talk about the second use case about copying objects. And here I'm gonna just clean a few things up. Let's remove everything here. And we're gonna say this is going to be the initial location. Right, so we have an initial location with a city, an array of zip codes, and a country, Germany. Now we want to say we want to work with the copied location. Now the copied location, we can simply use the spread operator to make a shallow copy of the initial location. If I use it just like this, the spread operator is going to look at each property of the initial location and it's going to copy that property to the new copied location. If I were to console.log copied location, like so, save this and let me clear things up, node spreading.js, you will see that we get exactly the same as the initial location. Now, we really need to be careful with shallow copying because if I modify the zip codes of the copied location, I will also modify the zip codes of the initial location. And that's because zip codes is a non-primitive type, which means that reference, or which means that assignment happens by a reference. Here, I'm not pointing to the contents of the zip codes property. I'm pointing to an quote-unquote address in memory. I mean, the match is not exactly this, doesn't exactly mean that, but I'm pointing to a place which is storing the contents. Now, in the copied location, I copied the reference to that place, but I did not copy all the contents, which means that if I change the contents of this of the place that both zip codes are pointing to, then both of them are going to be modified. I think a better example is to actually just do some code. Let's erase this and let's say copied location dot zip codes dot push, and here we're gonna add maybe the 1000, and we will also push 90, like so. And now if I were to console.log, and now you see here I'm in the copied location dot zip codes. If I were to console.log the initial location dot zip codes, you will see that this will also have changed. If I save this and run here, you will see that I actually have new values. I didn't add them, but because both zip codes are pointing to the same place, once I modify this in the copied location, the changes will also come into effect for the initial location. If I were to, for example, just write the console.log the initial location here, then we have the updated value. And this is very, very super important to keep in mind if this initial location would be something like some default values, right? Because let's say you use some default values here to create your location, and then you modify this some values in the created location, and then you use the default values to create a second location. Well, those default values are not going to be the same if they are non-primitive values. So a more secure way of doing that here would be to actually spread the default values, and then we would then again add a zip codes here. And this is going to use the spread operator within the array for default values dot zip codes, right? So now here I am actually copying each of the zip codes from my default values. If I save this, and because here I'm creating a new array, then I'm not pointing to that previous location. If I save this and I run the code, you will see that the zip codes of my original object are untouched, right? So here this would be enough, but as you may imagine, if here I have some objects, so if here I have some non-primitive types within my array, then this spreading operator here of when I'm creating this array, it's gonna copy things by reference. So still, if we change something here in the new zip codes, then we can actually change stuff in the default values object. So it's really complicated, and if you start doing it too much, I would actually say that maybe you need to rethink your code and try to make it simpler, because this deep copying, there is really not a one way of doing it. I mean, there are a couple of libraries which have some methods for deep clone and so on, but I have used some of them, and sometimes they work very well and sometimes they don't seem to work. I still seem to have bugs in the code. So if you are facing too many of these patterns, then maybe you need to step back a little bit and rethink the structure of your code, how you are working with the values, and try to find a cleaner way of copying values in JavaScript. It's getting quite confusing, so I think that for now, I think I've proved my point. Just be careful when using the spreading operator. Let's mark this as completed here in Notion, and let's move to the last part to talk about methods and the this keyword. Let's create a new file here, and that's going to be methods.js. And same with the creating part, you are already quite familiar with methods. So I'm gonna create a new object here, location, and this is going to be, let's say, again here, let's copy the city, zip code, and country from the previous files. And a method is one of those specialized functions that I mentioned in the previous part of the series, and it's really, it has the goal, it has the role of being a method in an object. So if I were to say here get full, or maybe I can also copy this here, yeah, why not, get formatted address, and transform this into a method. The goal of this function, so the method is a function. If I were to console.log type of location dot get formatted address, like so. I'm gonna save this. Let's come here, clear the whole thing, node methods.js, and we get a function, right? So a method is a function, but it has some nice functionality around the this keyword. And that is simply that the this keyword is pointing to the object of the method. So this is called the receiver of this function call, and so the receiver of this function call, and this is this object location. If I were to console.log this here, you will see that this is going to output the object that we are calling. So console.log, or even better here, we can just location.getFormatted_address, and we will see the object on the screen. If I save this and we run, then we get the object that we are calling this method from. So methods are, I would say, very useful, quite nice syntax as well, makes it very close to other concepts of object-oriented programming. And one thing that I want to discuss with you actually before closing this part about objects is what happens when we try to extract a method from an object. So here, what do I mean by extract a method from an object is simply to either assign this method to another object or to assign this method to a variable. Let's say that here, before we actually pass this method around, let's console.log this triple equal to location, right? Or strictly equal to location. If I save this and I run the code, we will get true, because here the method, this keyword, is pointing to the object location. Now, if I pass the method around, let's say that I have here another location, and then this another location is going to be, let's say, yeah, city Paris, zip code 90, country France, and then we say another location dot get formatted address is equal to location dot get formatted address, like so. And then I have another location dot get formatted address. Now we should see a different object being printed on the screen. We should see the another location object being printed, and this console.log will actually be false. If I save this and I run the code, now you will see that we have Paris and we have false printed here. And why does this happen? It is exactly because the this keyword changes. It's pointing now to the another location object. Another example is if we wanted to use the spread operator, the spreading operator, to pass the properties and methods from the location object as default values, and then populate or change whatever values we want in the another location. Once I save this, I still get the exact same behavior as before. So I have the updated values, but I have false here, and that's because this method, this keyword, is really pointing to the another location. So be careful when having methods in default values, and even more careful if you use this keyword within these methods, because depending on how you use this spreading operation to use this object as a default value, then this can change the behavior of this keyword. Another way of ensuring that this get formatted address actually gets the location instead of the another location, in case you want to do that, I know it sounds a little bit crazy, but there are cases where you want to do that, is to, for example, use the call from this method. And this call here, the first argument will actually be this keyword. If I pass location here, and once I save this and come back to the console, now run node methods.js, now you see that I'm actually passing the location object as this keyword. Now, you don't see this very often, but it's just useful to know that it's out there. The last thing I want to mention is about how to extract this getFormatted_address method to a certain variable. Now, of course, if I create a new function here, let's say some function, and I say location.getFormatted_address, like so, then I'm sort of quote unquote extracting the method from the object. Now, if I were to call some function, then you will see that all the properties that I have here, or all the this keyword is pointing somewhere else. If I save this and I run the code, node methods.js, so you see that it's an entirely different object, And of course, this is false, but here I have basically, I don't have any of these properties in the this keyword or in the this in the this keyword, I think you could say that, once I extract the method from the object and assign it to a certain variable. Of course, if I were to console.log the result of this function, like so, then we would get undefined, 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 right? Everything is undefined here because we do not have the city, the zip code, and the country properties. If I want to ensure that this function here is still bounded to this location, I can actually use the bind method of this method here, and I can pass location. So location.getFormatted_address.bind location. I know it sounds a little bit weird, but once I execute this, then I'm actually on the safe side, because now this function here, which is the extracted method, is bounded to the, or is bound to the location object. I know that this all sounds a little bit crazy if you're not familiar with objects or with how functions work in JavaScript, but if you have worked a bit with, for example, React and class components, then you probably came across this bind construct here, and this is why we need it. It's because when we are extracting these methods, then we lose the definition of the this keyword, and we need to reintroduce that definition by using this .bind. That's it for today. I hope this discussion gave you a solid understanding of the fundamentals of objects. Of course, I didn't cover everything that there is to know about objects, but I tried to at least give you a comprehensive overview of the basics. In the next video, we will go through JavaScript's inheritance mechanism, which is the prototype chain. If you don't want to miss that, subscribe to the channel and you'll get a notification when the video is out. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.